through this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to Bill C-322 this afternoon. My experience with crossings is a little bit different than my colleagues. In my riding, the issues around crossings have typically been the removal of them, and particularly in small towns, as train lengths have gotten longer and longer, we now find freight trains that are 2 miles in length. The railways have come in and actually have removed crossings, so in their words, to try to remove the danger of people trying to cross at those places. It's made it inconvenient for a number of small communities whose people often have to go around to get back to the place where they started. And the second other issue that I've had with rail crossings in the riding was CPR removing private or crossings that were used privately, and then actually, Mr. Speaker, not even acknowledging our contacts with them to try to get them to explain what they had done. So I sympathize with my colleague on this issue, but I don't think that she has found the correct solution to the problem. In short, this bill before us proposes to amend the Railway Safety Act to give the Minister of Transport the power to order a company to construct a railway crossing and to authorize the payment of subsidies then in that regard. And the bill is designed to address a particular problem in Montreal. And I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I find this to be typical of the presentation of my NDP colleagues' approach to legislation, and that is that the solution is always more and more government intervention and bigger government. And they always seem to take these issues that should be resolved locally and then take a national hammer to them and try to repair them that way. And I think that's what's happening here before. And for those of us who have lived under NDP governments, this is a very familiar picture for us. The solution, we believe, is not always more and more government telling people what they need to do and involvement with them. Of course, in my province, it's had a huge impact over the years. We find ourselves, after 50 years of NDP running the province, with an economy that's 1/3 the size of our neighboring province, and that's for that particular reason, that every solution was seen to be more and more government involvement until basically people left, the businesses left, and we did not have that economic development that we actually needed in our province to develop it. We ended up with dozens, I think up to 80 crown corporations in a population of less than 1 million people. Nationalized industries such as potash just about destroyed the complete potash industry before it was sold into private hands and then became a crown jewel in our provincial economy. So I hear my colleague from the back heckling me, but I should be apologizing to the people of Saskatchewan for having supported such policies. And we see the consequences, Mr. Speaker, in other provinces now. Unfortunately, our neighbours to the west, who were at one point 3 times the economy that we were, 3 times the population, suffering through the choice of choosing an NDP government. We know we're all familiar with things like raid A's in British Columbia, although the NDP has destroyed that provincial economy twice there. It seems that some people have forgotten that and maybe giving them another opportunity to drag British Columbia down. So, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that I don't actually, my colleague again points out he wants this to be an issue of relevance, but it is relevant, Mr. Speaker, because this is the only solution that the NDP have. And this legislation is principally designed, she wants a national solution to a challenging circumstance in her riding where, according to her, there are not enough rail crossings and therefore pedestrians in her riding are crossing the rail track at multiple uncontrolled locations and trespassing on private property. So at issue is just that lack of pedestrian crossings on the Canadian Pacific Railway Outremont spur. I wonder if this bill in its present form is actually necessary. Is this the only solution, this type of large-scale reach, the only solution to the illegal crossings that my colleague is referencing when she brought this bill forward? I'd like to take a minute or two just to take a look at what's in place presently. The Canadian Transportation Act, my colleague just referred to the NDP or the Railway Safety Act being vague and confusing, and he gave some examples, but I don't think this bill is going to be the solution to clear that up. The Canadian Transportation Act includes some provisions on rail crossings. Section 100 of the Act defines crossings as a road crossing means the part of a road that passes across, over, under a railway line and includes a structure that's supporting or protecting that part of the road or facilitating the crossing. The member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie says she wants to increase the safety of affected areas where producers our crossing, and I believe her approach is sincere, but as I mentioned, we have questions about the method that she has chosen. When we try to correct at-risk situations, we should be very careful that we're not creating new ones, and I think we would see that would happen if this bill was passed. As I mentioned, this bill, though it's trying to deal with a local issue, it will be national in scope, and it should be judged on that basis. Federal legislation already provides municipalities, local authorities with the authority to deal with these types of situations, with the ability to get a railroad to the table, to get a crossing built. Section 101 of the Canada Transportation Act tells us that if a municipality or a local authority and a railway cannot come to a conclusion and negotiate an agreement to build a crossing, the Canadian Transport Agency actually can step in. So they can authorize the construction of that crossing. They can determine what percentage of the construction costs each party will be responsible for, and they can determine, Mr. Speaker, who will maintain that crossing. Now, this current process puts the onus on each individual local authority, which I think is where it should be, to determine whether a new railway crossing is required, where and when that crossing is built and should be built, and then taking into consideration development plans and actually how much they're willing to contribute financially to see that crossing built as well. So I think the current legislative framework actually stipulates that if a local municipality or entity in a railway can't come to an agreement, then the Canadian Transport Agency can take over and assume responsibility. It can authorize the construction, and then actually it can determine how those costs are going to be split between the parties, both for the construction of the crossing and for the ongoing maintenance of it. So the reality is the minister can already help the parties to find common ground through various existing policies, can do it in a way that actually deals with the financial consequences for the stakeholders, because as with so many other things, money often ends up being the sticking point on many of these negotiations. Members told us about her work and the support that she's got from various agencies, but the reality is the Montreal Port Authority is not one of those agencies that supports her proposed legislative amendment, and that is the local entity that's involved in this situation. Municipalities have the primary responsibility for their own infrastructure. It makes sense for them to be the ones who decide when and if and where railway crossings, for example, should be built. And I guess it needs to be up to the Minister of Transport, or rather should not be up to the Minister of Transport, Mr. Speaker, to determine whether a crossing must be built in a local area. It needs to be given over to the local government to make those decisions, and that's where I believe that should stay. As I said, the Montreal Port Authority does not support this bill. The rail line affected by the members' initiative serves the port. And setting up new crossings, Mr. Speaker, would actually disrupt port operations. Just we can point out that if trains, they cannot stop at each grade crossing, the Port Authority has said that the company would have to then uncouple the trains, recouple the trains, allow people across the crossings, and that would significantly disrupt their operations and increase the risk for company employees and for the public. And certainly, I know that the member here does not want to see that as a consequence of her legislation. The reality is when people are crossing at uncontrolled locations, they're in effect trespassing on private property. And the sponsor of the bill is basically saying just because people are trespassing, putting themselves at risk, then the minister has some obligation to build crossings for them. And we don't believe that that's the case. In fact, increasing the number of pedestrian crossings actually increases the opportunities for people to be injured and or killed. And that is not a good solution to the issue that we're faced with here. I understand that my time is running short here, but statistics show that railway and road crossings are dangerous for Canadians. Data from at the end of October 2016 indicated a total of 89 accidents at road crossings, 16 fatalities and 20 severe injuries. So certainly this happens across the entire rail system. It's just not at these uncontrolled crossings where these problems take place. We don't see how Bill C-322 in its current form could help to improve and solve the problem once and for all. In our view, a broader approach to this is needed. Specific measures should be taken to improve the safety of the people crossing railway lines illegal in Canada. We need to come up with a framework to deal with that, and we will be opposing the bill because it proposes the wrong solution to the problem in Montreal and other densely populated cities that have rail crossings in them. The issue here is really that pedestrians are trespassing on private property, which typically has industrial activity also occurring, thus exposing people to major danger. The answer is not to give them even more opportunities to be injured and or killed.